Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, he'd like to wave goodbye, it's Matt Morgan.
Joey, what is the worst thing you can hear your surgeon say during the operation?
Anything. I don't want to be awake during an operation.
Okay, yeah, literally anything was the answer, but also first runner-up, I should say, is nurse, pull up the YouTube again.
This is just all bad.
Oh, no.
All of that's bad, Matt.
I don't know any of this from experience, so please don't think I had something go wrong, YouTube. Everything is just fine. It's just a joke.
All right. Up next, he has craft with cards with craft. It's Dana Roach.
Why don't snowmen wear deodorant?
Oh no, why?
What's the point? To them, everything smells like carrots.
Yeah, an appropriately winter-themed joke, Dana. Yeah. I like that. Less horrifying than what Matt was putting me through, so I appreciate you.
Yeah.
Joey, my joke kills at anesthesiologists conventions.
Just like that doctor.
It is their favorite.
How many of those conventions are you going to, Matt? This feels weird.
Still zero. Okay. Still zero.
All right. Lordy Lord. Matt, what are we talking about in this week's episode?
Well, this week we're going to talk about some popular cards that we just happen to not be playing in our own given decks. Maybe cards that are towards the top of the top cards on any given commander's page, but for some reason or another, we're not playing them in our specific brews.
Yes, yeah. We've done a whole episode about cards we don't play, especially for like social reasons, but these are going to be some that we want to dig into for strategical reasons. These are very popular for those given commanders, but there are reasons we choose not to put them into our decks, and hopefully that can help you figure out cards in your decks about like why you would or would not play things that apparently are really popular, but you want to make that deck your own. This should be interesting to get into. We've got some shoutouts to do before we get to it, though.
First, I'd like to thank Chase, better known as Mana Curves, for helping editing the show. You can find them on the interwebs at Mana Curves.
And if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by leaving a review on your local podcast app. You can subscribe on your local YouTube channels, or you can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have patron tiers of all sorts of levels. Whatever you want to get, there's a perk for that, which you can get over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the coveted weekly patron shoutout. And this week, we are going to give a very special shout out to Jordan Barrett. He grinned and Barretted it, and went to patreon.com/EDHRECast. And please don't judge how terrible my wordplay. But Jordan, either way, we appreciate the support.
Don't judge our terrible wordplay, Matt.
Ours.
We open every episode with a dad joke. Being judged for terrible wordplay is like the MO of this show. Let's just be honest with ourselves.
That is very true. So par for the course, Jordan. Thank you for fitting in so well already.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jordan. Okay, guys, let's get into our topic here. We are talking about those popular cards that we don't play, specifically ones that are popular on our commanders' pages, but there are strategical reasons why we've been like, this won't be the case for me and the way that I brew. And, hopefully hearing those different types of discrepancies with the data on EDHREC, hopefully, that can encourage folks out there to, think more critically about the cards that you're putting into your decks too, because, EDHREC is not a prescription. EDHREC does not feel that it is a prescription, and finding that individuality to make your deck feel more like yours is really, really important. So Dana, maybe we'll start off with you. When it comes to some popular cards that you don't play in one of your decks, where would you like to begin?
So, one of the things that's a little bit tricky here is because of how I brew, I have a lot of kind of oddball-ish decks. So I tried to stick to ones that I felt like most fit in how I built them, what the general kind of consensus is for most people who build that commander. So I'll start with Talan Sky Summoner. My Talran deck doesn't look that different from most Talran decks. I'm building it with a lot of spells that create tokens so I can swing at people and kill them with a bunch of drakes. It's just not that dissimilar from the typical list. And the first spell here that shows up on, I think it's the third most played card in Talran decks, is Negate. Negate is a fantastic counter spell. 1 in the blue, counter any non-creature spell. The thing is, I already have a ton of counter spells in that deck that counter all spells. One of the reasons I tend to run negate in decks is because of that single blue pip. If you're playing, 2 colors, especially 3, 4, 5 colors, not having to leave 2 blue mana up is a really big deal. It's not a big deal in a mono blue deck at all. So I don't feel the need to restrict myself to not being able to hit creatures with the counter spells I run. And I just don't have that many counter spells in the deck either. I'm not running 12 counter spells. I think I have 7 in the whole deck. I just don't need to run negate. The advantages it offers, particularly in the casting cost, aren't ones that really matter in that deck. So that's why I'm not playing it there. I'm a big fan of the card, and in 2 color decks and in 3 color decks when I've played them in the past with access to blue, I've ran it. Mono blue in a deck without a ton of counter spells, it just doesn't do what I want it to do.
Yeah, that's interesting, Dana, because negate is high-key one of my favorite counter spells. I, in fact, in most of my decks, which are not mono blue, would tend to prefer negate over counterspell, because most frequently I find that the thing I need to counter is someone pointing a removal spell in my direction or trying to get rid of my commander.
Yeah.
But again, like you said, those are multicolor decks, and I imagine for you, the double blue of a regular counterspell, or even the single blue of like a Stubborn Denial, although maybe you wouldn't use Stubborn Denial in that deck because your stuff has lower power, so it wouldn't trigger the Ferocious on that one, but maybe more like an Offer You Can't Refuse, for instance, or other utility things. Like I've seen you do some really gnarly things with an Arcane Denial, using that on one of your own spells to turn it into a draw spell, for instance. So I can see why there's more utility that you would get out of those other things when you're in fact not worried about the casting cost.
Well, and there's just so many, like you said, Offer You Can't Refuse. There's a lot of good cards that are effectively either doing something a little bit better for cheaper with maybe a little bit of a downside that's mostly negligible, or there's other counterspells with way more upside they're going to be able to get benefits out of. I know you don't love 3 mana counterspells, Dana, but there's a whole bunch of them. And then there's all of those 5 mana counterspells, the 6 mana counterspells that you also seem to like. Overwhelming Intellect, cards like that. Some of my favorite cards, Access Denied, some of those types of things. If you need a counterspell, you can get a lot more than just countering a spell. Or if you need to be hyper efficient, you have the Swan Songs. You have all those types of spells out there too. So,
and there are some decks I want that. Like there are like we said, like there's definitely, it's one of the first counter spells I reach for when I'm brewing a 2-color deck, and I would especially do it in a 3 or 4 or 5. But yeah, in this deck, it just doesn't, the sweet things it does aren't quite the things this particular deck wants.
Yeah, makes sense to me. I can move to one of my examples here. And Dana, I also wanted to stick to the same thing that you were saying there, where like there are some ways that we can build a commander that is strategically entirely different than what we're seeing on the EDHREC page. Like, for example, I have my Mimeoplasm deck where I'm focusing on making weird combinations with its ability, but there are a lot of folks out there, in fact, the majority of folks out there seem to be building Mimeoplasm more as like an ooze deck. Oops, all oozes. And so like, me not having a whole lot in common with that's just because of a strategical difference overall with the strategy. So I tried to refrain from having any of those examples. There is an interesting card here for a deck that does still have that strategical difference, but I think that this is still going to be an interesting talking point for my Thales Reverent Medium deck. That's my black-white tokens deck. And strategically, I've gone for, I'm just going to make a whole bunch of tokens, buff them up, and go smash. More often what we see on her page is that she can be built a little bit more aristocracy, more of those like Bastion of Remembrance, I'm going to ping you for my stuff that dies. But this card I think is independent of the strategy. Whether you're playing aristocrats or just all tokens with her, Hour of Reckoning could still be very, very good for that deck. And indeed, 48% of Thales decks are playing Hour of Reckoning, a 7-mana sorcery with Convoke that destroys all non-token creatures. Seems like just absolutely aces for a token deck. But this is one of the more popular cards for Thales that I am not playing in my deck. Because what I've gone for instead in my deck are things like Martial Coup or Elspeth, Sun's Champion. Those wraths that can still provide you with extra tokens, and more particularly, I want wraths that will do something when I have a completely empty board. And one of the issues that I've had with Hour of Reckoning is that it helps you when you're already ahead, as opposed to helping you get back into a game when you're behind. And so that's one of the reasons that I have avoided this particular wrath card. Matt, I know that you play a whole lot of tokens. Do you feel similarly about this card, or do you think that I'm off my rocker here?
No, I get where you're coming from for sure. I'm actually, if for the same reason, a card that comes to mind for me too is in my Ovika deck, which is all about making a bunch of tokens and Izzet colors. So same strategy, different colors. But I don't really love Battle Hymn all that much either, because the situations that you pointed out, Joey, it's only really good when I'm already ahead. Battle Hymn makes mana for all the creatures that you control, but you need a lot of creatures in play for Battle Hymn to be really good. So it's very, very powerful for sure. There's a reason that's one of the most played cards in Ovika decks, but it's only good when you're already ahead. And I think that's probably an entire category, really, that the three of us, we could talk about probably for days on end, is cards that are only good when you're ahead, because there are so many cards that people seem to love to play that fit into that category.
I mean, there are totally cases where you want those cards that press your advantage to put you into a winning situation. And Hour of Reckoning can be that for tons of players out there. I'm very, very sure of it. It's just that in the way that I've found myself building, I'm so dependent on having my board of creatures at all, which invites a lot of people to wipe the board pretty frequently, or even just deal 1 or 2 damage to all creatures in play, that having those things, getting to keep my 1/1s in play at all, just seems a little bit rough. And so strategically, I've just been like, you know what? When I play a, Necrotic Hex, where everyone sacrifices 6 creatures and I get 6 zombies left over, that works out pretty well for me most of the time, where I go from having nothing to having something again, and then I'm sort of putting my opponents on the back foot as opposed to pressing an advantage. I have a whole bunch of pump spells in the deck already that can press an advantage. It just having that different dynamic in the tempo. It's when comparing those rads, you really do have to determine what the tempo of them is actually going to feel like in game, and that can inform which of them would end up being the best for you.
And this came up when I talked about Negate with the number of pips too. Hour of Reckoning is 3 white mana, and depending on how you may have built your deck and how mana intensive it is, one person's version of that deck might lean heavily into black stuff. So you maybe very often can afford to spend 3 white. If your deck it goes in a direction, though, it can be very difficult to be able to spend that mana and do the thing you want. Or maybe your deck, the mana base doesn't, you use white so little, you don't often have 3 white pips. There's a lot of factors for this kind of card, I think, that really come up and are very tuned to the particular person who's brewing and playing it.
Yeah, there's a lot of personal preferences that play into it, especially the board wipes. There's some of those utility cards, you have so much flex room, you can really just find a spot, and you can almost justify 5 or 6 cards that are only filling 1 slot.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So Matt, you mentioned Ovika. Do you have any other examples from that deck too?
I do. So Kirk Prospector is the second most played card in the deck. On average, that's just seeing play so many different places, and I don't love it, and I don't play it because to me, Kirk Prospector is more of a storm card. It's a goblin. It's 1 mana. You can sacrifice a goblin to make a red mana. Pretty quick and simple, and it's very, very powerful. But if you're only really trying to do the storm off, you're going to make a whole bunch of tokens with Ovika's ability. Maybe you're making token or goblin tokens some other way. Then you're just going to sacrifice them all for more mana to keep everything going. But the strategy-wise, especially, I'm not trying to play a storm. I like attacking with my tokens. Call me crazy, instead of sacrificing them for mana. That's just a whole different strategy, if you ask me. And so I like to turn my tokens sideways for one, but also it only makes red mana. And like Dana, you were just talking about a second ago, that my Ovika deck leans pretty heavily into a lot of blue spells. And so being able to make effectively unlimited red mana, that doesn't really help me get across the finish line so much, because a lot of my spells are blue.
Yeah, that's one thing I think that I've really started paying attention to as I've kind of gotten, we'll use the term mature versus old.
Seasoned.
There we go. Yeah, weathered. As a commander player. That makes a big difference, the amount of colored pips in a spell, particularly someone like me who's fairly greedy with how many utility lands they run. That makes a big difference. And if a card is going to have 3 colored pips in its casting cost, it better be impactful, because it's going to be sometimes very difficult for me to cast.
I was just going to say that, Dana. I was just like, you are like, I'm surprised at how often you are still managed to fix your colors, despite how many colorless utility lands that you frequently run.
Yes.
Yeah. But no, Matt, that's especially paying attention to the color balance. That is a huge thing to pay attention to there, because the way that you build your deck might not immediately be obvious, but you might have a completely different ratio of blue cards to red cards than the traditional ways that Ovika is built. And so that can absolutely change the dynamic and how powerful certain cards can end up being for you. So yeah, I totally get it. And also just like if you're not really hoping to storm off, you're just like, here are some goblins, they go rawr, then that also totally makes a whole lot of sense. I'm doing that same thing that I mentioned with Elise. Strategically, I'm going a slightly different direction, but like the color balances is another thing that you have to pay attention to with how that will affect things.
Yeah, it's wild to me looking at the top cards for Ovika, Enigma, Goliath, because Kirk Prospector is number 2, and then number 4 is Transcendent Message, which costs 4 blue and X to cast.
Well, in talking with the color balance too, that can change before you realize it. You know, if you just swap out 1 or 2 cards every set, so monthly, like let's say you do it every 3rd set or something, like even making a few changes a year, you can find yourself having shifted that pip balance in what your spells require without even being aware of it. And suddenly that 3-mana spell that cost 3 of a single color that was easy to cast is no longer so easy. And that can get away from you very quickly. And how often does anyone sit and double check that? Like maybe you do when you first brew the deck, but like I'm somebody who probably pays a lot more attention to this minutia than most people. I would say all of us do, given that it's kind of our job. And I bet we don't do it nearly that much. So like it can get out of hand. And if you're not playing these cards, then it's easy to not worry about it when you're playing cards that have that 1 colored pip versus the 2 or 3.
Well, and while we're here, I mean, this is probably a good opportunity to shout out Archidect and Moxfield and kind of just all those, the current generation of deck building websites, because they've got a great resource to check that at the bottom of pretty much every deck page.
Yeah. They're able to check your color balances, your average mana curve, things like that. It's very helpful. And I guess speaking of mana curve, I mean, that's definitely another thing that can slip out of control if you're not paying careful attention to it. Yeah. Just like your land count, like, oh, you replace, you got a new fancy spell and maybe you'll cut a land for it. And then before you know it, you only have 32 lands and you're like, I can't cast anything. The same thing can totally happen with, gradually I cut a 4-mana spell and put it in a 6-mana spell. I've got a 5-mana spell and put it in a 7 and things like that. That can also really sneak up on you. That's a journey that I took with my Karazakar deck, where I was playing a whole lot of 6 and 7 drops, it turned out, and I really had to scale back on them. And so one of the cards that I scaled back on was the card Death Kiss, which shows up in 59% of Karazakar decks, and which doubles the power of stuff that attacks your opponents, which seems perfect for a deck where I am goading all of my opponent's stuff. That sounds fantastic. But I played maybe a game with this card, and I was like, okay, first of all, this is hard to cast, and I have so many 6 drops. I need to be a little bit responsible with myself. So that was one reason that I removed it. But then also strategically, I kind of noticed that in that deck, I actually didn't want a whole lot of effects that would cause my opponents to die too quickly, I guess. Or more particularly, that would enable my opponents to KO each other more quickly. Because when I'm goading my opponents, I actually kind of need them to stick around a whole lot for me to use the cards that Karazakar is trying to draw me when I'm goading all of their stuff. So I actually need those folks to stick around for at least a little bit longer as, like, I guess, meat shields. So there were a couple of reasons why I had to keep that one out of the deck after all.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't realize those things until you get a bunch of reps into the deck. Like, there are plenty of cards where you're like, oh, I get why this card's popular, until you play it and you're like, why is this card popular? Because once you start getting those recs, you realize that your little iteration of that deck, or even, your personal play style, or the play group you play most of your games with or something, just turns those screws just enough so it doesn't perform in your list the way it feels like it probably does for most other people.
I mean, we talk about those cards all the time, that it's a card it's really good for you. It's terrible for me, though.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And none of these instances I'm saying that anyone else is doing anything wrong for playing these cards that are popular. They can totally work out for folks. It's just that in this particular case, I found that when I cast it, I sped up the point that I got to a 1-on-1 against a single opponent. And it turns out that goad is not that great in a 1-on-1 situation. So I was like, maybe I need to be wiser about when I cast this, or maybe I just need to pay a little bit more attention to my mana curve, and I can go for another option in this card slot instead.
Well, an example here of a card that I think personal play style and personal brew style makes a difference. If you look at the Recce history of Kamigawa decks in EDHREC, Goreclaw, Terror of Kalsima, is one of the more popular creatures in that list. 3 and a green, creature spells you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast, and whenever Goreclaw attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. I had ran this in my list, at least when it first came out, just to try it out. it just doesn't quite work based on how I play that deck. My version of the deck is running a little bit lower to the ground. It kind of plays a little bit like a Storm List. And that means that there aren't a ton of creatures in that deck that have power 4 or greater that I'm casting to take advantage of the cost reduction or to take advantage of giving them trample. Additionally, the deck kind of tends to win with some kind of an Alpha Strike. And Alpha Strike is usually something that's already giving all those creatures trample or giving them evasion or giving them some way to punch through where, again, Goreclaw's ability doesn't necessarily do me any good. So it's a situation where like I get why people are running it, but it doesn't help me in how I've built that particular list.
Well, and Dana, the way that you built that deck too, especially sometimes the way Goreclaw works doesn't pan out because you're trying to kind of do the same thing only on a different axis so instead of cost reduction, you have a lot of effects in that Reki History of Kamigawa deck that double your mana or triple your mana and generate so much of a greater advantage so that the Goreclaw, that cost reduction is fine, but you're maximizing it in other ways. And so you don't really need a cost reduction because effectively you're reducing the cost in so many other ways on all of your spells, not just on creatures with power 4 or greater.
Yeah, and you're using a whole bunch of other things that also enable you to get that trample, as you mentioned. Mana sinks, for example, like Ronus the Indomitable and things like that, to make sure that when you do that, as you said, in Alpha Strike, the +1 in trample is at that point a little bit redundant. So yeah, I can totally see it. Because again, like as you both said, it's very stormy. The Alpha Strikes are going to feel like they kind of came out of nowhere. Sort of like when Joey segues into Challenge the Stats, that also sometimes comes out of nowhere.
Oh. Merry Christmas, Joey.
Speaking of redundancy, Dana.
No, Matt, you are honoring my segue.
This is redundant. We have a third person that thinks they can segue into Challenge of Stats. Per calendar year, only 2 people are allowed to do this. And so, Joey, I don't know where you're coming up with this type of nonsense where you think that you can just take your Christmas. Okay, fine. It's in your stocking. You already got it before Christmas, so
it's an early gift, the early Christmas present.
We're gonna have to make sure that when we do our final episode of the year, we count how many times Joey was actually able to get a segue into Challenge the Stats. But
the comments will let us know.
Yeah, but this was one of them, and I'm proud of me. So we'll be right back to this topic after we challenge a couple of the stats here on EDHREC, because there are a lot of them, but we don't always agree with them. So we'll be right back after this quick break. Okay, so gifts are hard. One thing that I've developed a pattern for is that I like getting new clothes over the holidays. My fella and I sometimes get new stuff for the New Year's holiday even, because it feels good to start a year fresh and feeling stylish. And yes, this applies to undergarments too. A new fit just makes you feel way confident, you know? But some years it's been hard to find something that feels right. So this year, I got us some MeUndies. They have so many different patterns and cuts, they're very flattering. They even have a bunch of stuff like comfy joggers and hoodies or onesies. And it's really cool to get to figure out whether we want to spend the holidays and start the new year feeling maybe more classic, or do we want to go for something more bold and expressive? And also, oh my goodness, that pair has puppies on it. Like literally the only problem I have with my MeUndies is that my newest pairs are still in the mail and I can't wear them just yet. If you're interested in a new fit for the holidays and the new year, knock out your holiday shopping today and get 20% off your first order plus free shipping at MeUndies.com/EDH. That's MeUndies.com/EDH for 20% off plus free shipping. MeUndies, comfort from the outside in. It's holiday time, and that usually means tons of gifts, tons of spending. And you know what you really don't need on top of all that? A super expensive wireless bill. It's the season of giving, but you know what? Don't forget to be generous towards yourself, too. Don't forget to give yourself a gift. And right now, you can give yourself the gift of insane savings, because Mint Mobile has their best deal of the year. When you switch to Mint Mobile and buy any 3-month plan, you'll get another 3 months for free. That's 6 months for the price of 3. And their deals start at just $15 a month. $15 a month, and the 3-month plan gets you 6 months? So for the price of a Commander Precon, I'd get half a year of premium wireless service? I'm doing that math right? I think that sounds like a deal. For a limited time, buy any 3-month Mint Mobile plan and get 3 more months free by going to mintmobile.com/EDH. That's mintmobile.com/EDH. New customers only. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
My challenge this week was sent to us by listener CJ Swarbrick.
That's a cool name.
CJ, it is. It's a mouthful, but CJ says, I find it hard to understand why Exocrine doesn't even appear on the page for Rakdos, Lord of Riots. CJ also says, from experience, I found it to be the perfect finisher in the deck. All you need to do is be a point higher in life compared to your opponents, and you can scale the damage as needed. So Exocrine is a card from the Warhammer 40k decks. It's X, 2 and a red for a Tyrannid creature. It's a 2/2, and it has Ravenous. So it enters the battlefield with X +1 counters on it, and if X is 5 or more, you draw a card when it enters. It has an ability called Bioplasmic Barrage. When Exocrine enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to each player and each other creature.
Huh.
It's a really good finisher, but actually I think the utility here for this is the fact that it can do both of the things you want.
Yeah.
Because you can't cast Rakdos unless an opponent has lost a life this turn, and creature spells you cast cost 1 less for each life your opponents have lost. It's absolutely a really good finisher late in the game when you draw it, but it's also one of those cards that you can cast early in the game just to chump everyone for a little bit of damage so you can then cast Rakdos. So yeah, it's a fantastic finisher, and I think just the utility in the deck of it being able to be something that you both use as a win condition and as a way to get Rakdos onto the field in the first place makes it the kind of card that absolutely should see more play than 1% of lists.
That is a very, very cool challenge. The fact that Rakdos will just completely demolish the X cost on that. X cost things in a Rakdos deck are very, very scary.
Yep.
That is a very cool challenge. I'm way into it. I'm going to go a little bit more wholesome with my challenge to stats here. I'm looking at an overplayed card in Sam and Frodo decks. That's the precon ones, the loyal attendant Sam who's making a whole bunch of food tokens. And this is really just a classic case of a card that is suffering from the precon effect. It came in the precon with these, I believe, and so that's why it's seeing play here, but it's really not that good. It's Shire Sheriff, which is a really fun name to say, but it's not a great card to play. Shire Sheriff is a 2-mana 2/2 halfling soldier with vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a token. When you do, you exile target creature and opponent controls until Shire Sheriff leaves the battlefield. So this is showing up in 36% of the over 6,600 Sam and Frodo decks that there are out there. I mean, yeah, you sacrifice the food, you'd get to temporarily lock down something, but this card isn't great. This card is a conditional Banisher Priest, and Banisher Priest is also not that great either. So I would go for a more permanent form of removal instead, even if it means that you're playing a little bit more, I don't know, play a Dispatch or something, right? You're making a lot of artifact tokens in that deck because there's so much food going around. That seems like it might be more reliable to me. So Shire Sheriff, we're going to have to lock you up instead because I don't think you're doing a good job of being the sheriff of that town. So I'd have to say cut that one from the deck.
Yeah, worse versions of already like average cards, probably a good opportunity to reconsider. So I will wrap up our challenge to stats this week with my own. So this week, Virtue of Courage is a card that I feel like has gotten overlooked in a lot of different decks. It is from Wilds of Eldraine. It is 3 red, and it's for an enchantment, but also has an adventure side. So the adventure says 1 in a red for an instant. Embereth Blaze deals 2 damage to any target. Quick and simple, cool. But the enchantment version says whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, you may exile that many cards from the top of your library, and you may play those cards this turn. This is so wild to me how powerful it is. And it's barely an 8,000 decks. It is such an upside outpost siege type of card with all that, the impulse draw. You're able to just crank through your deck. But like nobody seems to be catching on to it. There's Purphoros decks out there, just decks that are playing Purphoros that try to win that way. And yes, you might be trying to go a little faster than maybe Virtue of Courage lets you be, but things stall out. Things go wrong all the time. And people just aren't playing Virtue of Courage. There's Torwalki the Younger. 4% of Torwalki decks are playing Virtue of Courage. Even in cards from this own set, like Imodain, the Pyrohammer, 46% of Imodain decks are playing Virtue of Courage. That just seems off for some reason. There are so many decks that love to deal non-combat damage, and just none of them are playing Virtue of Courage. This is a very, very powerful draw engine. You're going to be able to get so much card advantage, and you don't even have to worry about milling yourself out because you may exile that many cards from the top of your library, and then you may play those. So it's not a mandatory thing where you sometimes you draw yourself out because you just happen to just draw too many cards and you couldn't opt out. You can totally do that with Virtue of Courage. So just being able to control when you're impulse drawing for, you dome somebody for 5 damage, that's a whole new hand in so many decks. It is scary how powerful this is. I just think it needs to be reconsidered by so many people. And it's a couple bucks. It is not an expensive card. And it's just, there's so much upside to this. Just give Virtue of Courage another look, people. There's a lot to love here.
That is a wild amount of card advantage that this card can give you.
Wild. This might be, honestly, in my opinion, one of the more slept on cards from Wilds of Eldraine.
Yeah. You were talking about this card before we started recording, and I was fully like, I'm sorry, what does this do? Like do I need to start playing more red decks here? This one really surprised me. I absolutely agree.
Yeah, it's just incredible how powerful it is. There's just so much to like.
So let's swing this back to talking about cards that we ourselves don't play very often. In one that I don't play in my Glissa the Trader deck is Mir Retriever. It's one of the most popular creatures in Glissa the Trader decks. And I had a Glissa deck for a lot of years, and I turned it to a Glissa Sunslayer deck. But Glissa's probably my favorite character in Magic, so I decided I'm going to build every Glissa into a deck. And
wild project.
Rather than spend a ton of time thinking about it, right? Because the way I brew decks is just a long process, and I didn't want to do that with these 3 decks. The other Glissa decks I was going to make, so I kept them kind of like what you would expect from those particular commanders. The Glissa Trader deck is doing artifact shenanigans, recurring things from the graveyard, so it doesn't look that dissimilar from the average Glissa the Trader list on EDHREC nowadays, with the exception of primarily Mir Retriever. Mir Retriever, I think the difference is it tends to be a combo piece. It's a 2-mana artifact creature. When Mir Retriever is put into a graveyard from play, return another target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. So I think this is a card that's tended to be used to kind of loop things versus being supplemental with Glissa necessarily. And I'm not doing that. I'm just running some value stuff I want to recur, built around artifacts, but there's nothing I'm looking to loop in that deck. So Mir Retriever would just wind up being kind of a redundant piece with Glissa. It's not going to add me anything to how I'm playing that particular deck. So I think this is an example of a piece that's a combo piece, and as someone who just isn't really playing combo, it's not helping me, so it's not in my deck.
Yeah, that shows up in 53% of the Glissa decks. I find myself curious if you play Scrap Trawler in your Glissa deck, which shows up in 64. And again, much like Glissa, it will get those artifacts back to your hand. So
not playing Scrap Trawler either.
Okay, yeah, interesting.
Yep.
And I imagine it's just a case of my commander's doing this for me already. I don't need this plan B.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can see that, because there are some cases where you don't necessarily need the plan B, I guess. And this kind of segues into one of my decks here as well, and a popular card for a commander that I'm not playing, and that's actually Ancient Green Warden in Titania Protector of Argoth. I've got a Titania deck that's the mono green commander who gives you elemental tokens when your lands die. And Ancient Green Warden is a very, very cool card that shows up in 53% of Titania decks. It's a 6-mana elemental that lets you play lands from your graveyard. Love to see that. And it doubles your landfall triggers. So make no mistake, this card's amazing. This card's really, really amazing. But the particular way that I've gone with Titania is so much about sacrificing my lands rather than landfall triggers that Ancient Green Warden would end up amplifying basically my backup plans. I do have Rampaging Baloths in that deck, but it's only there as a backup in case Titania doesn't get to do the thing that she does. And frankly, Titania very frequently gets to do the thing that she does. So even then, I'm just I don't have all that many landfall cards that this card would actually allow me to double up. It's nice that it lets me play stuff in my graveyard, but it's a 6-mana card, and I already have so many other effects in that deck that are like half this mana cost that let me get stuff back from my graveyard. Sometimes like I can play a Splendid Reclamation and that gets them back en masse. And those are pretty reliable for me to find in that deck too. So yeah, paying attention to those pieces of redundancy, those backup plans, and whether the cards in your deck are amplifying your backup plans, that's a lesson that I'm definitely taking from these examples that we've got here, Dana, because you really do have to be careful about whether those cards are helping your primary focus and the main engine that your commander is doing, and whether you actually need them given how reliable it is that your commander can, in fact, get away with doing that thing.
Yeah, I really like that. And that kind of leads into a little bit of the reasons that there's some cards in my Kyler Sigardian Emissary deck that I'm not playing. And if you look at the typical deck, there's a lot of Sigarda cards in there in general. Whether it's Sigarda Font of Blessings, where other permanents you control have hexproof, which they're in there to help protect all your humans. Angel of Glory's Rise, which enters battlefield, exiles all zombies, and you return all humans from the graveyard to the battlefield. There's a lot of cards like that I personally don't really think they're worth playing, because either it's in a weird situation where you're so far behind it may not be really doing a whole lot, or you're protecting something that you already have enough redundancy there that any creatures you want to play in a Kyler deck, you probably want them to be humans. So playing more angels, it waters down your deck. And I think that's a really, really valid concern for some players is, are you watering down your deck by putting in some of these support cards that maybe they kind of do a little bit of what you're trying to do, but it's not doing it in maybe the best way.
I mean, Matt, this is absolutely, an off-type creature in one of those types of decks. Like, that's a thing that I experience too. Gisa and Geralf is really popular, shows up in nearly 70% of Wilhelt decks, but that's a human. And so I don't play it in my Wilhelt deck. I try to keep as many non-zombies out of that deck as possible, because I'm playing stuff like Zombie Apocalypse, which kills all humans, or I'm playing stuff like Kindred Dominance, which would destroy everything that isn't a zombie. So yeah, there's a real opportunity cost to playing something that is slightly off type, even if objectively it does support that strategy. There's a way in which it is actually, you are missing out on certain other synergies that you could be doing. And I have to imagine that's definitely the case for Kyler, because Kyler gives all of your humans such a huge pump that having a creature in play that doesn't get that pump could be the difference in whether or not you're able to KO an opponent.
Yeah, a creature that doesn't get the pump, but also doesn't feed the pump either.
Yeah.
That's just such a weird thing. And so we were talking also before the show about the new Hawkball of the Surging Soul, the Merfolk pre-constructed deck from Rivals of Ixalan. There's an Evolution Sage in there, and I'm just kind of like, well, okay, I guess. Yeah, there's like a +1/+1 theme in there. But for the most part, it's all Merfolk, and all those Merfolk, if you want to talk about a snowbally type of creature type there, Merfolk is definitely probably the peak of, once the ball gets rolling, it's very, very hard to stop. An Evolution Sage is fine, but I really don't think it's worth going off the creature type in order to kind of get a cool proliferate whenever you play a land type of effect.
And sometimes too, the card just doesn't feel right. Like that,
sure.
That's not a quantifiable thing, but like I guarantee we've all had decks where you put this card in there and something just feels like it's off. You'll draw it and you're like, this isn't quite the right time to use it. And then you realize every time you draw it, it feels that way.
Well, there's something, well, and that can happen on two axes, right? Like there's, strategically, I'm struggling to find the window to play this, but then also emotionally, like there are cards that emotionally, it feels like, like here's my all unicorns deck, and then you play a Craterhoof Behemoth, and I'm just like, I'm not buying it. Like it just like emotionally, I would feel like this is wrong. This just feels wrong to me, you know? It also has that axis to it as well. So I totally feel you.
Well, speaking of cards that don't quite feel right in decks, Anger never feels good in a deck because it has this weird giant angry baby art that I always find off-putting. But more specifically, I have an Agnes Dragon's Lash deck, and while my particular version of the deck is mono red, it doesn't differ that much from a deck that's actually a Jund version of that deck in terms of the strategy. So when I was looking at the list of popular cards here that I'm not playing, I kind of ignored the ones that weren't red. And the first creature that jumped out at me that people are playing a lot of in that list that I'm not playing is Anger. Now, forgetting the art for a second, Anger's a card that gives all of your creatures haste, and this is a deck where the commander pretty much wants you to run creatures with haste. And I understand that maybe there's a couple of bodies in that list that you are going to want because they do something really powerful. Magna Brazen Outlaw is one that lets you sacrifice the treasures that Agnes makes to go tutor up some kind of a probably win condition style dragon. But how many of those are you actually going to be running that you need to give them haste? I feel like if you have to give haste to a bunch of creatures in a deck that wants you to run hasty creatures, probably just running the wrong creatures in the first place. It doesn't feel right to me for a bunch of reasons. And I'm not running because I don't need to. My deck is built around hasty bodies, and even if I wanted to run 1 or 2 or 3 that didn't have haste, I still don't think I could justify a deck slot just to give those couple of bodies the ability to swing the turn I played them.
What about things like EDHRECast the Hidden as well, which also gives haste but does impede your opponents? Are those in your considerations pile? Or?
And I am running those because they do the extra thing. I can ignore the fact that it gives my creatures haste and still be like, oh, that it doesn't feel like it's a wasted line of text on the card, because that's really all Anger does. So without that, Anger's just a body, whereas EDHRECast is still slowing my opponents up. It's still doing something, and it doesn't feel like having that redundant text on there doesn't accomplish anything.
Gotcha. Well, and so to me, I'm just like, well, Anger would definitely be really good if the deck is making a whole lot of tokens and then giving those tokens haste. But I'm not seeing that on Agnes's page.
Yes. Yeah.
So so why am I bringing it up? Even it doesn't apply here. I see the extra thing as like the argument for EDHRECast makes a whole lot of sense to me too, though.
So Matt, I think your last one you want to talk about was Okima and Khazur. What's the oddball card there that you aren't running that everyone else likes?
Well, there's 2 of them, really. One is a new card that I just haven't had a chance to really pick up, but also we talked about redundancy a little bit. Ozolith the Shattered Spire, just one of those put extra counters on things. I already have several of those types of effects in there, so that just kind of didn't really fit, and it wasn't really worth justifying spending $10 on a card that I already had 3 different copies of. Mm-hmm. But also, Cold Ice Selkie is a card that I used to like it 5-6 years ago, but I feel like Cold Ice Selkie in general is one of those cards that just the world to me passed up what Cold Ice Selkie could be doing in a lot of different decks. And so that one, it got cut because if I want to put +1/+1 counters on a creature, why not just put it on my commander that's going to win me the game instead of a utility creature that doesn't really have any built-in protection. Island Walk is fine, but to me, Cold Ice Selkie was great several years ago, but I think just kind of got power crept out, and I don't think people are really updating their decks to reflect that.
Matt, I will let you know that there are 79% of Kumena Merfolk players and Otrimi Mutate players that are just so mad that you would discourage people from their favorite little draw cards Merfolk boy.
That's fine.
But those are different strategies than the thing that you are talking about.
Completely different strategies, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. You're talking about a strategy where Ukima wants to be as big as possible, and so it's a little bit like the Rafiq problem, right? Where Rafiq gives your stuff double strike when they attack alone. And yeah, you could put other stuff into the deck that will have interesting attack triggers or interesting things when they attack an opponent, but most likely the most important thing for you to give double strike to is your commander damaging Rafiq. And I can imagine that's a similar thing that you're running into with Ukima.
Yeah, the only time that something else is getting double strike when you have Rafiq out is because Rafiq has summoning sickness and you happen to not have a Swiftfoot Boots in play. That's the only time that something else is getting double strike. It's the same thing in my Ukima and Khazur deck. The only time I'm putting +1/+1 counters on a creature that isn't Ukima is because Ukima isn't in play yet.
Yeah, there you go. So I have one final example that I'm kind of curious to hear from you guys. I think this is probably my more contentious example amongst them. I play a lot of black. We know this about me. Joey loves to play black. The necromancy is strong with this one. I have a mono black Sir Conrad deck, and Sir Conrad is annoying and just a truly a busted card. Why did they keep putting words on that? He does damage in so many ridiculous ways. But there's a card that I don't play in that deck that's very, very popular. And in fact, not just popular in Conrad. It's a very, very popular card for mono black in general. I think it's showing up in 18% of decks that can play it, and that's Feed the Swarm. Feed the Swarm is a sorcery in black that can destroy target creature or enchantment, but you'll lose life equal to that thing's mana value. And this is one of the few reliable ways that black can actually get rid of an enchantment. But I am not playing it in Conrad, and I'm curious to hear your reactions about this. Particularly the reason I've chosen not to do it is because I'm kind of listen, if they have it, they have it, and if they don't have it, I probably got this. And this is sort of a level of play that I've embraced where I don't want to, Matt, I think you said dilute the reliability of my strategy by planning for certain bad conditions to be there. If they're there, I'm losing anyway. Like, even if I were to remove the Rest in Peace, that is going to be the bane of my graveyard deck because it's doing all of the exile-y stuff and stopping my death triggers. I'm kind of like, if they've got it, me playing those ways of getting out of that bad scenario, the way that that deck plays and the metas or the games, the pods that I play it, are already moving so quickly that the game is over by the time I would try to remove something anyway. So I'm kind of just like, I've adopted a, if they have it, sort of attitude about that particular card in that particular example. I'm not saying that every mono black player out there should do this, because Feed the Swarm is a very, very good card if you need to destroy enchantments. It's just the particular pace of play for this particular deck is what's informed my decision there. And I'm wondering if you guys feel that way about any of those other backup plans where you're just like, I'm not even going to plan for contingencies because that's just not the tempo that this is going for. Do you feel that way too, or no?
I think yeah, definitely. And maybe not with that isn't a card that I've done it with. I tend to run Feed the Swarm in situations where I don't have an alternative, but I do think you just don't have enough slots in a deck to plan for everything. Not saying you shouldn't try, but there's also some situations where you just have to like take that look of like, well, if this happens, I'm just going to lose, and that's fine. Rather than run a mediocre solution to a problem, you're better off just running good solutions to other problems that you do have good solutions to, and accept the fact that once in a while you're going to get blown out.
Yeah.
And you'll offset that by having good games the other times when you're not faced with that one particular problem.
And a lot of times too, I would say that some of the cards that become like a universal problem, like we're talking about here, like Joe, you mentioned Rest in Peace. I would argue, maybe not argue, but I would think that for the most part, Rest in Peace isn't really played at the mid to lower tier tables. It's probably CEDH more focused, and then the higher power tables where like that's kind of more understood, that's what you're going for. Or Blood Moon, I think, is a similar type of card. Blood Moon absolutely is probably the right card to play in a lot of different decks, but kind of the social contract is pushed out. I think that's kind of pushed out some of those cards that require you to get into like a deep puzzle solving type of mindset with some of your answers that you're playing. So you're not really being punished as much for it anymore as you may be used to have when kind of the social aspect of the format wasn't near as fleshed out. And we've kind of talked about that with Back to Basics is another type of card that I think we used to see a little bit more across all given tables. And maybe it's kind of centralized itself towards the higher power tables now that kind of just players are a little more equipped to kind of socially handle these situations than they were before.
I mean, Matt, you say that, but like my mom plays Rest in Peace in her deck against me. So like, I don't know what to tell you.
Well, I like your mom, so that's probably why. Like, yeah.
So let's say it's not a specific problem for Joey and it's just a general problem. So like, let's say the person with multiple Planeswalkers in their deck drops a Doubling Season. That's going to be an issue. Again, maybe that's a situation where you're just like, well, that's an issue for everybody, not just you, right? Like that's going to be a problem for the other two players at the table as well. And again, maybe that's a situation where you're just like, I can't deal with it. I'm never gonna be able to deal with it. I will be able to deal with creature threats. So you guys need to deal with enchantment threats.
Sure.
I think that's a reasonable response, I think, sometimes in a deck, because you're like, I just can't do all the things. I'm going to focus on doing the best job I can with the things I can do a good job on. And I better hope you guys can handle the other things. And if you all can't, then maybe I lose that game and we play a new one.
Yeah, you're sort of assuming the title of delegator. It feels like maybe your solution there. I also kind of feel like, in particular, like the way that Conrad especially goes is just like, listen, my strategy is I know I have to kill the people who could drop a Rest in Peace before they get the chance to do it. And that's really my only out. It's just like full throttle. I'm going all in on this. And if it doesn't work out, it super doesn't work out. It will blow up in my face. But that just sort of feels like to remove the player is actually the best chance that I have, rather than trying to. And I play all the graveyard decks, so I've experienced this a lot. And folks sometimes will they'll message me asking like, what can I do to save my graveyard from being exiled? And my attitude is pretty similar to the Feed the Swarm thing in this particular example. I'm just like, if they exile it, it's gone. And I'd rather focus on having the ability to rebuild and refill that graveyard rather than trying to prevent them from taking away what was there. Because it's just like trying to plan for contingencies A, B, C, and D is just going to dilute the ability for plan A to be able to get off the ground in the first place to me.
Absolutely.
Might not be an attitude that everyone out there shares. This was just one particular example that I wanted to mention, that this very popular removal spell I'm not playing in Conrad. I'm playing it in a lot of other decks. It's in my Will Held deck.
Yeah.
Like there are definitely cases where being able to destroy enchantments when you're not usually able to, yeah, that's really good. This was just a particular one where the tempo was something I wanted to pay attention to, and I hope that that is helpful for people who are listening.
And the way I would phrase it, Joey, is it's like you've just focused on solving A, B, and C, and like D can be someone else's issue.
Yeah, you can't play for literally every single situation. There's just, the format is just way too big for that these days.
Yeah.
Play for what you're going to see.
Yes.
Maybe metagame a little bit if you have to, but like you're never going to have every single answer for every situation. Just sometimes somebody's going to win, and sorry it's not you, or well, sorry it's not me, I should say, but like you can't always have every situation handled.
So I think as we kind of reach the end of the particular examples we have, because the reality is these cards probably aren't going to be the ones that people listening right now aren't playing in their deck.
Right.
But I almost guarantee that if you go through the list, there's going to be ones that you aren't playing that are very popular on the list as well. I think it is a useful exercise to take a look at it, though, and really think about why you aren't running those cards and what your reasons are, because I almost guarantee people that aren't running them have pretty good reasons. And I think knowing those things helps you just be a better deck builder in general, knowing why you're not doing the things you're doing, and really having clarity of thought and purposefulness about why you're brewing the way you're brewing, I think is useful.
That's exactly it. Like, I think probably a whole lot of folks have had the experience of like looking through, like they just cut a card from their deck and then maybe they go and browse an EDHREC page and they're like, okay, but it's showing up in like 80% of those decks. Am I the crazy one? And like, it didn't work for me. Why is it working for everyone else? But like, yeah, just like, EDHREC doesn't
the
feel
children
that it's
are wrong, Joey. It is the children that are wrong.
But yeah, it's just like no one who works for EDHREC thinks that EDHREC is a prescription.
Yes.
Like, go with the thing that feels right to your deck, and that is going to be a you thing. It is just a resource of like, oh, here are some cards that could be interesting to play. It seems like a whole lot of people do, but also those little discrepancies are going to be one of the things that makes the deck feel a little bit more like it's yours, and being critical of the things that you're doing and finding the ways that bring you the most joy in the game is the whole point of all of it anyway, right? So yeah, don't feel like you're the one who's going crazy.
Yeah, play what makes you happy. Segue what makes you happy.
Segue what makes you happy, Matt.
Yeah. We can wrap up the show right here if we really want to. That's not against the rules. So like if we wanted to tell people where they can find us on social media, that's totally allowable. You can find me, for example, pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. It's pretty easy. We can segue however we want to segue. Dana, would you like to segue us out too?
I mean, sure, I might as well. We're trying different things. I mean, for example, you could find me on the interwebs at Dana Roach. I am maybe running articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, and I guess it's possible you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
Matthew Cinnamon Toast Crunch Morgan. I'm so since I got my segue in this episode, you're taking it away at the end of the episode.
It just felt right to do in the moment. And it's Matthew Captain Crunch Morgan.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz online, most likely being a fool on Instagram or something like that. And you can find the cast at EDHRECast everywhere online. Plus, if you've got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Our thanks go out once again to Chase for their fantastic work in the post-production of the show. You can find them online at Mana Curves. And listeners, we'll be right back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.